Chapter 26, Part 1 of Social Statics by Herbert Spencer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Social statics, or the conditions essential to human happiness specified and the first of them developed by Herbert Spencer. National Education 1. In the same way that our definition of state duty forbids the state to administer religion or charity, so likewise does it forbid the state to administer education, inasmuch as the taking away by government of more of a man's property than is needful for maintaining his rights is an infringement of his rights, and therefore a reversal of the government's function towards him. And inasmuch as the taking away of his property to educate his own or other people's children is not needful for the maintaining of his rights, the taking away of his property for such a purpose is wrong. Should it be said that the rights of the children are involved and that state interposition is required to maintain these? The reply is that no cause for such interposition can be shown until the children's rights have been violated, and that their rights are not violated by a neglect of their education. For, as repeatedly explained, what we call rights are merely arbitrary subdivisions of the general liberty to exercise the faculties, and that only can be called an infringement of rights which actually diminishes this liberty, cuts off a previously existing power to pursue the objects of desire. Now, the parent who is careless of a child's education does not do this. The liberty to exercise the faculties is left intact. Omitting instruction in no way takes from a child's freedom to do whatsoever it wills in the best way it can, and this freedom is all that equity demands. Every aggression, be it remembered, every infraction of rights is necessarily active, whilst every neglect, carelessness, omission is as necessarily passive. Consequently, however wrong the non-performance of a parental duty may be, however much it is condemned by that secondary morality, the morality of beneficence, it does not amount to a breach of the law of equal freedom, and cannot therefore be taken cognizance of by the state. 2. Were there no direct disproof of the frequently alleged right to education at the hands of the state, the absurdities in which it entangles its assertors would sufficiently show its invalidity. Conceding for a moment that the government is bound to educate a man's children, then what kind of logic will demonstrate that it is not bound to feed and clothe them? If there should be an act of Parliament provision for the development of their minds, why should there not be an act of Parliament provision for the development of their bodies? If the mental wants of the rising generation ought to be satisfied by the state, why not their physical ones? The reasoning which is held to establish the right to intellectual food will equally well establish the right to material food. Nay, will do more, will prove that children should be altogether cared for by government. For if the benefit, importance, or necessity of education be assigned as a sufficient reason why government should educate, then may the benefit, importance, or necessity of food, clothing, shelter, and warmth be assigned as a sufficient reason why government should administer these also, so that the alleged right cannot be established without annulling all parental responsibility whatever. Should further refutation be thought needful, there is the ordeal of a definition. We lately found this ordeal fatal to the assumed right to a maintenance. We shall find it equally fatal to this assumed right to education. For what is an education? Where, between the teaching of a dame school and the most comprehensive university curriculum, can be drawn the line separating that portion of mental culture which may be justly claimed of the state from that which may not be so claimed? what peculiar quality is there in reading, writing, and arithmetic which gives the embryo citizen a right to have them imparted to him, but which quality is not shared in by geography and history and drawing and the natural sciences? Must calculation be taught because it is useful? Why, so is geometry, as the carpenter and mason will tell us. So is chemistry, as we may gather from dyers and bleachers. So is physiology, as is abundantly proved by the ill health written in so many faces. Astronomy, mechanics, geology, and the various connate sciences, should not these be taught too? They are all useful. Where is the unit of measure by which we may determine the respective values of different kinds of knowledge? Or, assuming them determined, how can it be shown that a child may claim from the civil power knowledge of such and such values, but not knowledge of certain less values? When those who demand a state education can say exactly how much is due, can agree upon what the young have a right to and what not, it will be time to listen. But until they accomplish this impossibility, their plea cannot be entertained. 3. A sad snare would these advocates of legislative teaching betray themselves into, could they substantiate their doctrine. For what is meant by saying that a government ought to educate the people? Why should they be educated? What is the education for? Clearly to fit the people for social life, to make them good citizens. And who is to say what are good citizens? The government. There is no other judge. And who is to say how these good citizens may be made? The government. There is no other judge. Hence, the proposition is convertible into this: a government ought to mold children into good citizens, using its own discretion in settling what a good citizen is, and how the child may be molded into one. It must first form for itself a definite conception of a pattern citizen, and having done this, must elaborate such system of discipline as seems best calculated to produce citizens after that pattern. This system of discipline it is bound to enforce to the uttermost, for if it does otherwise, it allows men to become different from what in its judgment they should become, and therefore fails in that duty it is charged to fulfill. Being thus justified in carrying out rigidly such plans as it thinks best, every government ought to do what the despotic governments of the continent and of China do. That regulation under which in France private schools cannot be established without a license from the minister, and can be shut up by a simple ministerial order, is a step in the right direction, but does not go far enough, seeing that the state cannot permit its mission to be undertaken by others without endangering the due performance of it. The forbidding of all private schools whatever, as until recently in Prussia, is nearer the mark. Austrian legislation, too, realizes with some consistency the state education theory. By it, a tolerably stringent control over the mental culture of the nation is exercised. Much thinking being held at variance with good citizenship, the teaching of metaphysics, political economy, and the like is discouraged. Some scientific works are prohibited, and a reward is offered for the apprehension of those who circulate Bibles, the authorities in the discharge of their function preferring to entrust the interpretation of that book to their employees, the Jesuits. But in China alone is the idea carried out with logical completeness. There the government publishes a list of works which may be read, and considering obedience the supreme virtue, authorizes such only as are friendly to despotism. Fearing the unsettling effects of innovation, it allows nothing to be taught but what proceeds from itself. To the end of producing pattern citizens, it exerts a stringent discipline over all conduct. There are rules for sitting, standing, walking, talking, and bowing, laid down with the greatest precision. Scholars are prohibited from chess, football, flying kites, shuttlecock, playing on wind instruments, training beasts, birds, fishes, or insects, all which amusements, it is said, dissipate the mind and debase the heart. Now, a minute dictation like this, which extends to every action and will brook no nay, is the legitimate realization of this state education theory. Whether the government has got erroneous conceptions of what citizens ought to be, or whether the methods of training it adopts are injudicious is not the question. According to the hypothesis, it is commissioned to discharge a specified function. It finds no ready prescribed way of doing this. It has no alternative, therefore, but to choose that way which seems to it most fit. And as there exists no higher authority either to dispute or confirm its judgment, it is justified in the absolute enforcement of its plans, be they what they may. As from the proposition that government ought to teach religion, there springs the other proposition that government must decide what is religious truth and how it is to be taught. So the assertion that government ought to educate necessitates the further assertion that it must say what education is and how it shall be conducted, and the same rigid popery which we found to be a logical consequence in the one case follows in the other also. 4. There are few sayings more trite than this, that love of offspring is one of our most powerful passions. To become a parent is an almost universal wish. The intensity of affection exhibited in the glistening eye, the warm kiss, and the fondling caress, in the untiring patience and the ever-ready alarm of the mother, is a theme on which philosophers have written and poets have sung in all ages. Everyone has remarked how commonly the feeling overmasters all others. Observe the self-gratulation with which maternity witnesses her firstborn's unparalleled achievements. Mark the pride with which the performances of each little brat are exhibited to every visitor as indicating a precocious genius. Consider again the deep interest which in later days a father feels in his children's mental welfare and the anxiety he manifests to get them on in life. The promptings of his natural affection being oft-times sharpened by the reflection that the comfort of his old age may perchance be dependent upon their success. Now, servants and interpreters of nature have usually supposed these feelings to be of some use. Hitherto, they have always thought that the gratification accruing to a mother from the forwardness of her little ones serves as a stimulus to the proper culture of their minds, that the honor which the father expects to derive from the distinction of his sons acts as an incentive to their improvement, and that the anticipation by parents of the distress which ill-trained children may one day entail constitutes an additional spur to the proper management of them. In these strong affections and mutual dependencies, observers believe they saw an admirably arranged chain of influences calculated to secure the mental and physical development of successive generations, and in the simplicity of their faith had concluded that these divinely appointed means were fully sufficient for this purpose. It would appear, however, according to the state educationists, that they have been mistaken. It seems that this apparatus of feelings is wholly insufficient to work out the desideratum, that this combination of affections and interests was not provided for such a purpose, or what is the same thing, that it has no purpose at all. And so, in default of any natural provision for supplying the exigency, legislators exhibit to us the design and specification of a state machine made up of masters, ushers, inspectors, and councils, to be worked by a due proportion of taxes and to be plentifully supplied with raw material in the shape of little boys and girls, out of which it is to grind a population of well-trained men and women who shall be useful members of the community. 5. But it is argued that parents, and especially those whose children most need instructing, do not know what good instruction is. In the matter of education, says Mr. Mill, the intervention of government is justifiable because the case is one in which the interest and judgment of the consumer are not sufficient security for the goodness of the commodity. It is strange that so judicious a writer should feel satisfied with such a worn-out excuse. This alleged incompetency on the part of the people has been the reason assigned for all state interferences whatever. It was on the plea that buyers were unable to tell good fabrics from bad, that those complicated regulations which encumbered the French manufacturers were established. The use of certain dyes here in England was prohibited because of the insufficient discernment of the people. Directions for the proper making of pins were issued under the idea that experience would not teach the purchasers which were best. Those examinations as to competency which the German handicraftsmen undergo are held needful as safeguards to the consumers. A stock argument for the state teaching of religion has been that the masses cannot distinguish false religion from true. There is hardly a single department of life over which, for similar reasons, legislative supervision has not been or may not be established. Here is Mr. H. Hodson Rugg, MRCS, publishing a pamphlet to point out the injury inflicted upon poor ignorant householders by the adulteration of milk, and proposing as a remedy that there shall be government officers to test the milk and to confiscate it when not good, police to inspect the ventilation of cowsheds and to order away invalid cattle, and a government cow infirmary with veterinary surgeon attached. Tomorrow someone else may start up to tell us that bad bread is still more injurious than bad milk, equally common, quite as difficult to distinguish, and that consequently bakehouses ought to be overlooked by the authorities. Next, there will be wanted officials with hydrometers and chemical reagents to dabble in the vats of the porter breweries. In the wake of these must, of course, follow others commissioned to watch the doings of wine merchants, and so on, until in the desire to have all processes of production duly inspected, we approach a condition somewhat like that of the slave states, in which, as they say, one half of the community is occupied in seeing that the other half does its duty. And for each additional interference, the plea may be, as it always has been, that the interest and judgment of the consumer are not sufficient security for the goodness of the commodity. Should it be said that the propriety of legislative control depends upon circumstances, that respecting some articles the judgment of the consumer is sufficient, whilst respecting other articles it is not, and that the difficulty deciding upon its quality places education amongst these last, the reply again is that the same has been said on behalf of all meddlings in turn. Plenty of trickeries, plenty of difficulties in the detection of fraud, plenty of instances showing the inability of purchasers to protect themselves are quoted by the advocates of each proposed recourse to official regulation. And in each case, it is urged that here, at any rate, official regulation is required. Yet does experience disprove these inferences one after another, teaching us that in the long run, the interest of the consumer is not only an efficient guarantee for the goodness of the things consumed, but the best guarantee. Is it not unwise then to trust for the 100th time in one of these plausible but deceptive conclusions? Is it not rational rather to infer that however much appearances are to the contrary, the choice of the commodity, education, like the choice of all other commodities, may be safely left to the discretion of buyers? Still more reasonable will this inference appear on observing that the people are not, after all, such incompetent judges of education as they seem. Ignorant parents are generally quick enough to discern the effects of good or bad teaching, will note them in the children of others, and act accordingly. Moreover, it is easy for them to follow the example of the better instructed and choose the same schools. Or they may get over the difficulty by asking advice, and there is generally someone both able and willing to give the uneducated parent a trustworthy answer to his inquiry about teachers. Lastly, there is the test of price. With education, as with other things, price is a tolerably safe index of value. It is one open to all classes, and it is one which the poor instinctively appeal to in the matter of schools, for it is notorious that they look coldly at very cheap or gratuitous instruction. But even admitting that, whilst this defective judgment is not virtually so extreme as is alleged, it is nevertheless great. The need for interference is still denied. The evil is undergoing rectification, as all analogous ones are or have been. The rising generation will better understand what good education is than their parents do, and their descendants will have clearer conceptions of it still. Whoso thinks the slowness of the process a sufficient reason for meddling must, to be consistent, meddle in all other things, for the ignorance which in every case serves as an excuse for state interposition is a very gradual cure. The errors both of consumers and producers often take generations to set right. Improvements in the carrying on of commerce in manufactures, and especially in agriculture, spread almost imperceptibly. Take rotation of crops for an example. And if this tardiness is a valid argument for interference in one case, why not in others? Why not have farms superintended by government? Because it may take a century for farmers generally to adopt the plans suggested by modern science. Did we duly realize the fact that society is a growth and not a manufacture, a thing that makes itself and not a thing that can be artificially made, we should fall into fewer mistakes, and we should see that, amongst other imperfections, this incompetence of the masses to distinguish good instruction from bad is being outgrown. 6. When, in the matter of education, the interest and judgment of the consumer are said not to be sufficient security for the goodness of the commodity, and when it is argued that government superintendence is therefore needful, a very questionable assumption is made, the assumption, namely, that the interest and judgment of a government are sufficient security. Now, there is good reason to dispute this, nay, even to assert that, taking the future into account, they offer much less security. The problem is how best to develop minds, a problem amongst the most difficult, may we not say the most difficult. Two things are needful for its solution. First, to know what minds should be fashioned into. Next, to know how they may be so fashioned. From the work to be done, turn we now to the proposed doers of it. Men of education, as the word goes, they no doubt are. Well-meaning, many of them, thoughtful, some, philosophical, a few. Men, however, for the most part born with silver spoons in their mouths and prone to regard human affairs as reflected in these, somewhat distortedly. Very comfortable lives are led by the majority of them, and hence things as they are find favor in their eyes. For their taste, they are shown in the subordination of national business to the shooting of grouse and the chasing of foxes. For their pride, it is in wide estates or long pedigrees, and should the family coat of arms bear some such ancient motto as strike hard or firth fortune and fill the fetters, it is a great happiness. As to their ideal of society, it is either a sentimental feudalism, or it is a state something like the present, under which the people shall be respectful to their betters and content with that station of life to which it has pleased God to call them, or it is a state arranged with the view of making each laborer the most efficient producing tool, to the end that the accumulation of wealth may be the greatest possible. Add to this that their notions of moral discipline are shown in the maintenance of capital punishment and in the sending of their sons to schools where flogging is practiced and where they themselves were brought up. Now, could the judgment of such respecting the commodity, education, be safely relied on? Certainly not. Still less might their interest be trusted. Though at variance with that of the people, it would inevitably be followed in preference. The self-seeking, which consciously or unconsciously sways rulers in other cases, would sway them in this likewise, could not fail to do so, whilst the character of men is what it is. With taxation unequally distributed, with such a glaringly unjust apportionment of representatives to population, with a nepotism that fills lucrative places with Greys and Elliots, with a staff of 100 admirals more than are wanted, with lavish pensions to the undeserving, with a system of retrenchment which discharges common men and retains officers, and with such votes as those given by the military, the naval, the landed, and the clerically related members of Parliament, we may be quite sure that a state education would be administered for the advantage of those in power rather than for the advantage of the nation. To hope for anything else is to fall into the old error of looking for grapes from thorns. Nothing can be more truly utopian than expecting that, with men and things as they are, the influences which have vitiated all other institutions would not vitiate this one. Thus, even were it true that in the matter of education, the interest and judgment of the consumer are not sufficient security for the goodness of the commodity, the wisdom of superseding them by the interest and judgment of a government is by no means obvious. It may indeed be said that the argument proves only the unfitness of existing governments to become national teachers, and not the unfitness of a government normally constituted, whereas the object of inquiry being to determine what a government should do, the hypothesis must be that the government is what it should be. To this, the reply is that the nature of the allegation to be met necessitates a descent to the level of present circumstances. It is on the defective interest and judgment of the people as they now are that the plea for legislative superintendence is based, and consequently, in criticizing this plea, we must take government as it now is. We cannot reason as though government were what it should be, since before it can become so, any alleged deficiency of interest and judgment on the part of the people must have disappeared. 7. The impolicy of setting up a national organization for cultivating the popular mind and commissioning the government to superintend this organization is further seen in the general truth that every such organization is in spirit conservative and not progressive. All institutions have an instinct of self-preservation growing out of the selfishness of those connected with them, being dependent for their vitality upon the continuance of existing arrangements. They naturally uphold these. Their roots are in the past and the present, never in the future. Change threatens them, modifies them, eventually destroys them. Hence, to change, they are uniformly opposed. On the other hand, education, properly so called, is closely associated with change, is its pioneer, is the never-sleeping agent of revolution, is always fitting men for higher things and unfitting them for things as they are. Therefore, between institutions whose very existence depends upon man continuing what he is, and true education, which is one of the instruments for making him something other than he is, there must always be enmity. From the time of the Egyptian priesthood downwards, the conduct of corporations, whether political, ecclesiastical, or educational, has given proof of this. Some 300 years B.C., unlicensed schools were forbidden by the Athenian Senate. In Rome, the liberty of teaching was attacked twice before the Christian era, and again afterwards by the Emperor Julian. The existing continental governments show by their analogous policy how persistent the tendency is. In the universality of censorships, we see the same fact further illustrated. The celebrated saying of the Empress Catherine to her Prime Minister well exhibits the way in which rulers regard the spread of knowledge. And whenever governments have undertaken to educate, it has been with the view of forestalling that spontaneous education which threatened their own supremacy. Witness the case of China, where diligently impressed ideas such as, "Oh, how magnificent are the affairs of government! Oh, what respect is due to the officers of government!" sufficiently indicate the intention. Witness again the case of Austria, where in accordance with the will of the Emperor Francis, the training of the popular mind was entrusted to the Jesuits that they might counteract the propagandism of liberty by the propagandism of superstition. Nor have there been wanting signs of a like spirit here in England. That attempt in Cobbett's day to put down cheap literature by an act which prevented weekly publications from being sold for less than sixpence unmistakably indicated it. It was again exhibited in the reluctance with which the newspaper stamp duty was reduced when resistance had become useless, and we may still see it in the double-facedness of a legislature which professes to favor popular enlightenment and yet continues to raise £1.25 million sterling yearly from taxes on knowledge. How unfriendly all ecclesiastical bodies have been to the spread of education everyone knows. The obstinacy shown by the Brahmin in fighting against the truths of modern science, the fanaticism with which the Mahometan doctor ignores all books but the Koran, and the prejudice fostered by the religious institutions of our own country against the very name of philosophy are kindred illustrations of the conduct which this self-conserving instinct produces. In that saying of the monks, we must put down printing or printing will put down us. The universal motive was plainly expressed, as it was, again, through the mouth of that French bishop who denounced the Bell and Lancaster systems as inventions of the devil. Nor let anyone conclude that the educational zeal latterly manifested by church clergy indicates a new animus. Those who remember the bitterness with which Sunday schools were at first assailed by them, and those who mark how keenly they now compete with dissenters for the children of the poor, can see clearly enough that they are endeavoring to make the best of a necessity, that having a more or less defined consciousness of the inevitability of educational progress, they wish to educate the people in allegiance to the church. Still more manifest becomes this obstructive tendency on considering that the very organizations devised for the spreading of knowledge may themselves act as suppressors of it. Thus it is said that Oxford was one of the last places in which the Newtonian philosophy was acknowledged. We read again in the Life of Locke that there was a meeting of the heads of houses at Oxford, where it was proposed to censure and discourage the reading of this essay on the human understanding. And after various debates, it was concluded that without any public censure, each head of a house shall endeavor to prevent its being read in his own college. At Eton, too, in Shelley's time, chemistry was a forbidden thing, even to the banishment of chemical treatises. So uniformly has it been the habit of these endowed institutions to close the door against innovations, that they are amongst the last places to which anyone looks for improvements in the art of teaching or a better choice of subjects to be taught. The attitude of the universities towards natural science has been that of contemptuous non-recognition. College authorities have long resisted, either actively or passively, the making of physiology, chemistry, geology, etc. subjects of examination, and only of late, under pressure from without and under the fear of being supplanted by rival institutions, have new studies been gingerly taken to. Now, although vis inertiae may be very useful in its place, although the resistance of office holders has its function, although we must not quarrel with this instinct of self-preservation which gives to institutions their vitality, because it also upholds them through a lingering decrepitude, we may yet wisely refuse to increase its natural effect. It is very necessary to have in our social economy a conservative force as well as a reforming one, that there may be progress for the resultant. But it is highly impolitic to afford the one an artificial advantage over the other. To establish a state education is to do this, however. The teaching organization itself and the government which directs it will inevitably lean to things as they are, and to give them control over the national mind is to give them the means of repressing aspirations after things as they should be. Just that culture which seems compatible with their own preservation will these institutions allow, whilst just that culture which, by advancing society, threatens to sap their own foundations, or, in other words, just that culture which is most valuable, they will oppose. The sanguine will perhaps hope that, though this has been the rule hitherto, it will not be the rule in future. Let them not deceive themselves. So long as men pursue private advantage at the expense of the common weal, that is to say, so long as government is needful at all, so long will this be true. Less marked, the tendency will no doubt be in proportion as men are less unjustly selfish. But to whatever extent they lack perfect conscientiousness, to the same extent will vested interests sway them, and to the same extent will institutions resist change. End of chapter 26, part 1.